One huge thank you to Julia for joining us today. She is not in the U.S. You're in Sweden, is that right?
I am, but
Oh, it
I'm
is quite
American, so
okay. So it's quite a bit later there, and so do you still celebrate
yeah.
the Fourth? Do you shoot things off in Sweden on the Fourth? Or
No, but we just had Swedish Independence Day on June the 6th, so hey, there you go.
okay, you could overlap those types of celebrations.
Or National Day. I don't know that it's Independence, but it's National Day.
Okay. Well, Julie's going to be
Yeah.
talking to us about forecasting and probabilities, and I'm really excited to hear this. I know this is something that is near and dear to many people's hearts because this is something we get asked a lot. So, with that, turn it over to Julie, and thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, for having me. Mark has just been a person that I always go to for really great content and good information. So I was thrilled that he asked me to come talk. I mean, that made me feel good about myself. And I'm glad that you all get to hear from him often and the people that he brings. And today I'm going to talk about forecasting, but not just any old type of forecasting. A forecasting where you have to understand the odds and bring a little bit of probabilities to your normal forecasting. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Just to, let's see, get my screen. Just to put it out there, what I do, I'm not going to be talking about my company or my apps, though you will see screenshots. This isn't a sales pitch or anything. But I do have apps that work for around this area. Some of you may already be using those, but I'm the co-founder of a company called 55 Degrees. We have many apps that help people get work done easier. Forecasting is one of those ways. If you're interested in those, you can talk to me separately outside of this meetup. But everything that I'm going to talk to you about today in this talk, you can do with no tools. You can do with tools. You can do with pencil and paper, and you can use spreadsheets, whatever you want. As long as you start and finish work, you're going to be able to use the concepts in this talk. So no fear that you're going to hear all this great stuff and then not be able to use it because you can't get a certain tool or something. It's not what today is about. What today is about is the fact that we have to accept that we can't have certainty at work and, at least 99% of what we do. And forecasting is no different. Talking about the 4th of July, and, that brings me to founding fathers. And even way back then, good old Ben here knew that in this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes. And some people even find a way to get around taxes. So there is very little certain in the world, right? Now, one thing that is definitely not certain at work is when things will be done, but people tend to want a certain answer to that question anyway. And we have to be careful when we give information because when we give a forecast, if we don't give any information about that forecast likelihood or our confidence in how that outcome is likely to happen, people will fill in the gaps with what they want to be true. So if we give people a forecast, just take the Gantt chart for instance, nothing against Gantt charts in particular, but the thing I want to point out with a picture like this, which has no accompanying information, is that I'm seeing, okay, there are these different lines, and those lines generally equate to an effort of some sort, right? I don't know a lot about it, but I do see that there's a start and a finish sort of intuited from this. And I'm only seeing one option for each of these items, but I know that certainty doesn't exist, and I know that there are probably more possibilities than those one items, right? One option. But we're not giving any information in most of these kinds of pictures that tell people how certain they should be about the information we have. And they fill in those gaps, right? And in situations like this, where one forecast builds on another, we're building our little house of cards that blows away at the first fall of the project, right? When there's dependencies, everything just sort of does like a domino effect. So it's not a problem that we can't be certain. It's a problem that we're not communicating the probability or the level of certainty or confidence that we have in the information that we're giving people. And that's what I'm going to spend most of the talk talking about. But first, I want to tackle this question of certainty. Now, you don't have to take my word for it, even though I'm sure you're already proving it to yourself day after day, project after project at work, that certainty is a myth. There's a book called The Art of Action by Stephen Bungay. And in this book, he posits that there are three gaps that get in the way of having us be able to have that 100% certainty that we seek. These three gaps are between sort of steps of the process, which, we have outcomes that we want to happen. We want to create awesome plans that will lead to certain actions that go back and achieve those ideal outcomes that led to the plan in the first place. Sort of that three-step process: plan, do, cash in, or whatever. I can't remember the right thing. But let's take that through the cycle a minute. So, if we think we have a plan that will get the job done, we can't be certain about that, right? We might fall into this gap called the knowledge gap. And this shows up in that space between having the outcomes you want and then trying to make a plan to achieve those outcomes. Okay. And this gap exists because there is a difference in what we want to know, what we need to know, what we can actually know at this point about what it will take to get the outcome we achieve. There's a difference between those two things. So we don't even know what we don't know sometimes, right? If you think about the concept of agile, and especially, well, how we're going to take what we know, do small experiments, learn from it, take that learning and incrementally, or iteratively get towards where we want to go, because that whole concept exists because we realize there are things we don't know, right? So if you believe that you need to take this sort of agile or iterative approach to getting the work done so that you build the right thing, then you're already acknowledging this knowledge gap, whether you knew that that's what you were doing or not, right? And when we can't be certain that we can know everything we need to know to make a perfect plan, we realize that we can't plan our way out of complexity, right? We can't make a perfect plan. But let's say that we had a magic wand and we could make a perfect plan. We knew exactly what we're going to need to do to get this outcome that we want. Well, even then, we could fall into the second gap, which is the alignment gap. And it shows up in the space between that perfect plan and the actions that need to be taken to put that plan into effect. And what this gap is the difference between what we want people to do and what we instruct them to do versus what they actually do. Okay. I don't know about you, but I'm sure I have seen a gazillion times a meme of someone wanting you to build a tree swing. And then, based on all these different interpretations of what that meant, you've got like 16 different versions of that swing. Right. And we know that if you write a one-page document and I give it to four different people, not everyone is going to interpret every single sentence or line in that document in exactly the same way. Right. People have patterns of thinking and are neurodiverse, and they think for themselves, and everyone is a bit different. So even if I could encourage them to switch off their independent thinking, I can't know enough about each person and how they think to write up the right documents, because you need different ones for different people to achieve the exact actions we want. So I can't make a perfect plan. I can't ensure that people will interpret my plan the same way and that they'll do what I want, right? So those are the first two gaps. Now let's say again, I can wave a magic wand. I've got a genie and I've got three wishes. My second wish was to fix this gap. Now we're still could get caught in the third and final gap, which is the space between outcomes and actions and outcomes. And it's called the effects gap. Now, if you have ever done the same thing multiple times and gotten a different outcome at least one of those times, you have fallen into the effects gap. The truth is that we work in complex systems. What makes something a complex system is it has many interacting parts that have their own stuff going on, and it's difficult to see the entire system, much less control it. So, what the gap effects gap means is that we can never fully and confidently predict exactly how an environment will react to the actions we take. So even if we could overcome those first two gaps, I can't guarantee that every single time my actions will have exactly the same outcomes. Okay. But so what do we do now? Knowing what we know. Well, what we often do is double down, right? We, you know, uh, intellectually understand that we can't have certainty. But even when we do that, we think, oh, okay, that plan didn't work. Let's spend twice as long making a better plan, right? Oh, those people didn't do exactly what I wanted them to do. Let's, write more detailed requirements, docs, let's put more rules into place about how you interpret this thing or that thing, and more controls to ensure that systems act the way we want. Now, sometimes those things might be good, but more of doing the same thing, more of activities that are trying to get us to certainty are just not the direction that we need to move. We need to come to a way that realizes that we can't have certainty. So we need to stop trying to chase that elusive dream and find techniques that allow us to work within uncertainty and actually and sort of embrace it. Right. And when you're thinking about doubling down, the workplace version of ruling it harder, doubling down from, say, a Gantt chart, not that it's bad to have a project plan like this, but if we think that having something like this gives us certainty, then we're spending a lot of time and money fooling ourselves. So while this can add value, it does not give us certainty. So we just need to keep that in mind. Um, Now, all of these things that give us one possible outcome, those are deterministic forecasts. Okay. Like I said, they communicate a single possible outcome, even though we know because certainty doesn't exist that there are more than one possible outcome at play. And the key part is that it provides no probability of that outcome. Right. I don't know if I'm 100% certain, 99%, 50%, no idea. And we can only really use these forecasts. They're only effective. They're only safe, I guess is the right way to say it, in situations where certainty can be assured. So usually not at work, right? There are very few places where we can have certainty. Um, what we want to do instead, like I said, is find a tactic that can work in uncertainty. And a tactic that we can try and use is called probabilistic forecasting. Now, you will know when you experience or interact with a probabilistic forecast when you see two components. That's, I'm going to start with the second one first, a probability. So think about the weather. There's an 85% chance of rain, right? So 85% chance, that's the probability. We know there's a 15% chance of it not doing whatever we're forecasting. And then you have a range of outcomes. For the weather, it could be it's going to rain in the next hour, sometime in the next hour, from this first minute to the 60th minute, right? So we don't know which one of those minutes precisely because, again, we can't have certainty, but we know in this range of times, there is a 85% chance that you will experience some precipitation, right? That's what we're trying to say there. So when we look at work and when things will be done, the way it might sound is that there's an 85% chance that this work, whether it's a single item or a group of items, we don't know yet, and we haven't gotten there yet. But it would sound like this: it will be done on or before a certain date. So that is anytime between now and that date. There's an 85% chance that we'll be finished by then, and there's what we call the downside of any odds, right? There's a 15% chance that it will take longer. Okay. Now, this is what we want to use when uncertainty is present because we're not avoiding it, we're tackling it head on, and we're giving information out in both of those components that helps us share the risk associated with the information we're providing. The risk is the probability, and the risk is also in that range. Okay. We're going to go over how to create two types of probabilistic forecasts. One is for a single item. So I've got this one story, say, whatever you call it, a work item, it doesn't matter. And I want to know how long it's going to take to get done. That, quintessential question, when will this be done? This thing that I want you to do for me. And then we have multiple item forecasts. Obviously, we know what that is. It's a group of items, more than one. There are two types, fixed date and fixed scope. So we're going to talk about how we can get to a point where we can understand the likelihood, the probability for answering these questions. So how many items can we finish by a fixed date? How much work can we do by this, event, this date that can't be moved? Or if we have a fixed scope, we have to get this amount of work done, or maybe there's a fine that's, too hefty to bear. When can we finish this fixed scope? Right? So these are questions that we can use data to answer. For any of those questions, you might think that you need a ton of data. So hopefully one of the things that will surprise you out of this talk is how little data you need for each work item, and with a little asterisk that I'll have to explain later, how little data as far as the number of items you need to statistically give good forecasts. Okay. Now, you can see here a little example. It doesn't matter which one of those forecasts you're doing, the single, the multi, the fixed date, the fixed scope. We essentially need no more than these three pieces, these three columns you see in this spreadsheet. So we need to know the individual work items. And it's less for us about which work items they are as the fact that this is a work item. Here is the day that we consider it started, and here's the day that we consider it finished. Okay. And that is all the data that you need. So even think about it, even if you don't have a work management tool and you have a board with sticky notes, you can take that sticky note and write the day it starts on it and write the day it finishes on it, and then flip it over and calculate some stuff that we're going to go through. So keep that in mind. Tools do not get in the way of us doing this. We're going to do single item forecast. I'll stop for a few questions and then do multi items and then go from there. If anyone has a burning question, just interrupt me in the meantime. There are flow metrics that we're going to cover today because each one of these types of forecasts take a different flow metric to help us figure out. Now, the single item forecast, the metric that we need to use is cycle time. I'm going to give you my definition of cycle time. That is, how long does it take to go from a start point to a finish point? And it's the total elapsed time. Okay. So I understand that weekends happen and holidays happen, and people get sick and there's smoke breaks and there's evenings and all of that. But just to simplify it, especially for global situations, think about it when you're trying to remove all these bits and pieces from your elapsed time to make the number as small as possible so that you feel good. What the end result really cares about is how long it took you since you started. It cares not what happened in between those points, right? And so that's what we're using at this point. And yeah, I'll stop there on that. But you may hear this called lead time, cycle time, flow time, any kind of time. You can use whatever term you want. Just know that when I say cycle time, I'm generically referring to a total elapsed time between a start point and a finish point. And what's cool is that you can define any start point and any finish point, and these concepts still work for you. So you can zoom in, have a very narrow part and do all of this stuff, or you can zoom out and have your whole system and do this stuff too. So as long as you're consistent with a start and a finish, all the stuff we talk about here applies. Okay, now I'm going to tell you how I am calculating cycle time in these examples here. I am choosing to use a day level granularity. Okay, so I'm going to calculate it by the finish date. minus the start date, and then I add a 1 because I'm adding the 1 because if you need to subtract dates and include both start and finish date, you have to add 1 back on to make it inclusive. So that way I'm counting my start date and my finish date and not leaving anything out. Okay. Now, if you wanted to have a smaller granularity, as long as you replace the word date in that calculation with your unit of time, finish week minus start week, finish hour minus start hour, etc. Minute. You can do any granularity, it scales. But for us, I'm just using days for simplicity. Okay. Now, how do we look at the cycle time data? Because it's easy to calculate that for each individual card. Let's take the sticky note example. You turn it over, you do that calculation, you write a number of days as your cycle time on that card. What do we do with it? How can we take that data and turn it into something that can tell us probabilities and help us forecast? Well, good news is that single item forecasts are super simple because we can use a simple scatter plot of your cycle times to allow us to look at your data in an aggregate and see what's likely to happen. I want to think about why we do this or how you think about figuring out what's going to happen when you aren't quite sure. Let's say you want to find out what are the odds of flipping heads on a coin when you coin toss, and if you don't know that, how do you find it out? Well, you flip that coin over and over and over again a number of times. You generate some data, and then you can see the percentage of times that had certain outcomes or others. So in that case, it's sort of binary, heads or tails. With your work, each time you finish an individual piece of work, it's like a flip of that coin. Because the question we're asking is, how long does it take to finish a single piece of work? Every work you finish is another data point to answer that question. So what you see here on this chart are just a bunch of times you've finished work. Each dot is one or more items, and it's plotted according to the date it finished and that cycle time calculation that we talked about. So the ones up top took longer, the ones on the bottom took lower. Okay. Now, what I can do with this is I can look at this data and I can tell you pretty easily information about how long things took to take in the past and how many items took that long. Okay. So, for instance, I can look and I can say 50% of these dots finished at 7 days or less. Okay. What that means is that 50% of these items represented on this chart finished in 7 days or less. I can look and and the way I do that is it's not complex math. Let's say there's 100 dots on this page. I count up from the youngest one, right? The most optimistic option that happened, and I count up until I get to number 50. And then I just draw a line where that 50th dot is, and whatever that cycle time number is, in this case it was 7, I can say literally 50% of these 100 dots finished in 7 days or less. If I want to find the 85th percentile, I count up to the 85th dot and I draw a line there, and so on and so forth. You can do that with any number. Now, how do I turn that into a forecast, right? Well, one of the ways that you can think about it is that um, there's a rule of thumb that I'm going to get into a little bit. I've got a few slides down, but I'm going to go ahead and get into it right now a little bit. Is that we have a process that we use to do work. We've got a team that has a certain makeup to do this work. We've got, policies and other conditions that were in place when we were doing this work that generated this data. In general, if we haven't had any big changes, then the outcomes that you see here, it's reasonable to assume that future outcomes will be similar. So basically, if nothing's changed, why do we think anything different will happen, right? So what that means is that we can use this historical data to forecast what might happen in the future, not with certainty, but with a probability, just like flipping that coin over and over again. We can use this to give some forecasts about how long it could take us to finish a future piece of work. Okay. Now, how do we pick which percentile that we're going to use? How do I know which probability to use when giving a forecast? That's something that I can't answer for you. You have to think about that for yourself a little bit. What's your risk tolerance, right? The probability you choose, there's a couple of key things to consider. One is going to communicate how much lack of certainty you have, how much chance it will take longer than the time frame you're giving them. So if I were to say, hey, there's a 50% chance this is going to happen, well, people probably aren't going to be too happy with that because there's just as much of a chance of being on that downside, being longer than the date, as there is being within the date range that you're giving them. So 50% probably doesn't work in most of our kinds of contexts. Then people ask, well, like, if we go up to the highest point and we just use that whole range, can we say we're 100% certain? Well, we sort of have to go back to that whole lack of certainty, three gaps thing. And we also have to remember that from a data perspective, um, something could always happen that's never happened before, right? We could have some crazy thing that, we can't predict. That's why we're trying to use probabilities. So we can't be 100%. Then someone will say, well, can we be 99% certain? Um, you can try, and you can say, okay, I'm going to give you a forecast that says I'm 99% certain that we'll finish this within 45 days or less, right? What I've done is just basically take anything you've ever done and made a super wide range that's just going to irritate people because a lot of stuff gets done much quicker than that, right? So essentially, I've included all of my data points. And that's a bit like the weather service coming on and saying, there's a there's a hurricane coming and it's going to hit somewhere on Earth, right? That's so wide as to be a little bit useless. So we need to be a bit more targeted because some of these outcomes are not very likely. So we don't need to pad the estimates, as it were. There's something else that you can do to improve your ranges if you're not happy with some of that. But how do you choose it, right? Think about the risk tolerance. What's going to happen? What's the fallout if you fall on the downside of the odds you're choosing, downside of the probability? The higher the consequences, the, the higher range you might want to use, the higher probability. But because as you increase your probability, you're having to use a wider and wider range of outcomes, that cycle time, the whatever days or less is going to get bigger and bigger. There's a bit of a balancing act that you want to do. Maybe 85% is better for you. You can say instead of being 95% that things are going to take 23 days or less, maybe 85% is okay. And you can have a much more balanced 16 days or less. Hopefully that makes a bit of a sense. If you ask a consultant, they're going to say it depends. It's one of those context-driven answers. So hopefully they will lead you and ask you questions so you can decide what the right choice is there. Okay. So basically find the right balance, not too many outliers, but not too much risk either. And then once we do that, we are going to deliver our forecast probabilistically. So 85% of the time, we finish work item in 16 days or less from the day it starts. Okay. If you say that, you've delivered a probabilistic forecast. You've given two ways to express risk, right? And you haven't explicitly said it, but you've implicitly told people there's a 15% chance that something worse could happen. If some people need to hear that, if they don't fill it in their own brain, feel free to tack that on to the end. And you're going to have to say this over and over and over again to people and talk to people in this way before they really start to understand what you're telling them. Because I'm sure many of you know, you might come to this and people might block out that chance and hear 16 days or less. And, so you're going to have to keep using new language with people over and over before it really starts sinking in, and maybe even have some conversations about that. Now, before we take a quick break for questions, I want to get back to the underlying rule of thumb. And this is something that exists anytime you're trying to use your historical data to forecast what could happen in the future, right? Because we know that's not a perfect endeavor. The past will never be exactly like what our future is, or vice versa. It's indicative. Okay. So the general rule is that the data that you, or the conditions that you had when you generated your data, need to be roughly similar to the conditions that you'll have for the period that you're trying to forecast. Now, I will point out that conditions is a pretty wide net. Think about all the things that go into impacting cycle time, right? There are things inside of your control and things outside of your control. So it could be policies that you create about how much work you can have in progress at a given time. It can also be things like your team's capacity, vacation time, or skill sets and things like that. The good thing is that good consultants can help you analyze, or you don't even need a consultant, but if you people who understand how to read scatter plots and look at patterns can help you look at that same scatter plot that we used, talk about the differences in patterns and when shapes change and stuff, and that will actually help you talk about that stuff. And what when I talked to one of our customers about that, when we talked about her scatter plot, what I pulled out of them was like, oh, this is when we changed the type of work we did, or this is when we added a new person. And those conversations help you figure out which data to use. Because after that last major change, now you know where the representative data starts for what's likely to happen now. So you can use the same chart that you can make with 3 data points to talk about that without getting into any more complicated analytics. Um, we don't need precision. Things will never be exactly the same. They just need to be roughly similar. Sort of, it works out in the wash as long as it's not majorly different. I think what some people always say is that we're trying to be approximately right instead of precisely wrong. That sort of helps you. Um, let's take a couple minutes for questions on this so far, and
So I
then we'll do multi-item. Yeah.
So I've been looking through the questions here. One of the ones that came up is we talk about something being done. What does that mean, and how does that matter?
Yeah. Yeah, so the cool thing about that question is that you get to decide, because all that matters from a flow metric standpoint, and this is so the 4 flow metrics, and you can find these what I refer to as flow metrics in a couple different places. One is the Kanban guide that you can find on prokanban.org. The exact same flow metrics are published in the Kanban guide for Scrum teams from scrum.org. So we're talking about cycle time, um, throughput, work in progress, and work item age. Those are 4 basic flow metrics that are like just your basic health check stuff. So like when you go to the doctor and they take your temperature and they take your weight and stuff, even before you talk to them about what's wrong with you, there's basic health check stuff, right? Um, so each of those, the first thing you do before you can measure them is that you have to decide together, what do we mean by start and what do we mean by finish? So if I go to this next slide, you'll see I've got a board here in the background, because the board is a good visual way of representing like a process. So you have to decide with your whoever's doing the forecast. It could be just you, or it could be with your team. You can say, okay, what are we going to mean by start for this particular purpose? Well, now it's going to mean I'm going into in progress, the first active stage, maybe, right? And then for finish, maybe it means it's all the way out to the customer. So now I can take that start and finish point and I can see the health of that part of the process. But at the same time, I can say, okay, now I need to put another hat on, get another perspective on. Now I need to go all the way from idea to done, or maybe just idea to release ready. The point is that as long as you're picking a start and finish for a purpose, and you're consistently using that for measuring things within that purpose, it can mean anything you want. Then when you change your perspective or purpose, you pick your start and finish point and you measure with those things. You sort of put those stakes in the ground. Um, and it can move with you. You can choose whatever you want.
Well, and I think
Hopefully that makes sense.
a key to that is to make sure you don't measure from start to maybe into QA and use it to predict from start to production, because that's not measuring, that's not the same thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, you pick a start to finish and you stick with it until you're finished with that purpose. And then you can redefine your start and finish, but you have to stick with it for the purpose. Like exactly like you said, you need to compare apples to apples. Um, yeah, and just like there are nuances because this is an overview, right? So there are definitely nuances and deeper things that we can get into. That apples to apples is going to be an important thing all the way down, right? So if I'm using data, cycle time data of one type of work, it's going to represent that type of work, right? I can't use that to forecast a different type of work that I don't have the data for. So you have to understand what you're looking at and the context of start and finish and understand what that represents. And then you can forecast whatever that represents. But you can't forecast things it doesn't represent, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So I've got
Yeah.
there's some other questions here, kind of a discussion around the sizing of the work. And
Yeah.
so Simon had something here about how do you explain to your colleagues that this approach is not impacted by the variable size of the work items, or is it impacted by? How do you think about sizing, and how does that play into this? And particularly, another aspect of this is, do story points play into this type of forecasting at all?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. And it's one I had to answer earlier today and didn't do quite as good of a job as I hope I will do right now. But so size, what do we mean by that? In the end, if we're talking about we're talking about how big the work is, right? And what that means can take on a few different things. Like um, we use story points to talk about bigness in terms of complexity, right? That's what it's supposed to mean. I spend a lot of time arguing it doesn't mean time, and then try to argue the same thing to turn it back into time, right? It's sort of really weird. But if let me get back to the first point, and then we can talk more about story points if you want. Um, there is a variety of cycle times on this chart, right? They're not all 5. Or, let me go back to this chart, right? And so some of that variation of cycle time will be caused by different sizes of work and what we generally mean by size, right? Some of the variation is caused by other factors. When we try to overinflate the importance of size, we neglect the other impacts to cycle time. When we overinflate the importance of story points in particular as the driver of the difference in cycle time, we neglect to recognize the fact that um, there are many other things that impact how long items take than just complexity. Um, I don't have it in this slide deck. And we're actually talking about adding this to our tools, less of a feature to be used, is more of a feature to explain this point when we talk about it. But if you were to take a scatter plot like this and look at just all your items with one story point, right? With story point value of 1. Because you can add more columns to that data set that we showed just 3, right? You can add more stuff and then use that to sort it down. You'll find that they don't all have the same cycle time. They're not all 3 days, right? Or 1 day. It's going to be a range of a range of cycle times for that story point value of 1 stories. You'll find the same thing for your 3s, your 5s, your 8s, etc. You'll find one thing is that after a certain point value, one thing that I found is that if you're doing sprints and stuff, above a certain point, they never finish within a sprint. So you're going to find the bigger ones maybe much higher. So there's a lot of ways I could go, but I'll just cap it off here and say that um, we don't want you to make all your work the same size because it's not realistic. It is blending sizes together, but we don't think that's a bad thing, right? Just as size is only one input to where each dot lands, we're also not separating out all the other impacts to how long it took to do a piece of work and trying to segment stuff that way. What we want to do is use this data to understand the ranges it takes for any confidence level. And then we want to use that data and our happiness with those answers to improve those outcomes. I'd much rather spend time on getting that 85% line down for my work as a whole than over focusing on making sure that I'm segmenting by, these smaller factors. And we use, we can go into another talk later on how to take this predictability you see here and how to improve it using your data.
And that
Let me
sounds.
know if that,
Bob,
if
Bob
that
was
helps.
saying.
I know it doesn't answer.
Bob
Yeah.
was saying that would statistics be improved by normalizing? And I think what I hear you saying is yes, it might, but there's probably so much low hanging fruit that the effort's probably better spent on bringing that 85% down.
What we do is something called right sizing. Um, and what we try to say is, let's say this is my team's data, and I'm like, okay, team, for better or for worse, it takes us 16 days or less to get a work item done, 85% of the time. So let's say we want to use that as a service level expectation for our team. This is the expectation that you can expect from our service. This is what happens. Here's the proof, right? We want to at least make sure that we've sized 85% of our work, that we feel like we can get it done in that 16 days or less, right? That may be different than your story point value, but we need to take a gut check to see, does this pass the sniff test of being able to finish under that 85th percentile line? If not, we need to break it down if it can be. Because remember, we don't need to force things into false boxes, and we don't need 100% of items to finish by then. That's just fool's work to try to force everything into one size box. So you may not be happy with 16 days. So maybe you want to start right sizing for a smaller number of days, right? So you pick a time period you want to be able to finish most of your work within and use that as a right sizing guide. If you do that over time and you focus on controlling the age of the work that you've actually started, then all of these dots will get lower, most of them, but enough to really reduce your stuff.
So
That makes sense.
one other question I want to throw out there, and then we'll let you go on. Somebody was
Yeah, we'll
asking
keep on. Yeah.
how many data points, like, how do you know how many data points you need to start being accurate?
Yeah. Can we save that one till
Yeah,
after multiple
perfect.
items? Because it'll be a good way to that's a good question for all of it. Yeah.
We've
Okay.
got blanks,
And
we've got
I
blank
think
screen
it's,
now.
oh yeah, thanks. It will be especially relevant for the multiple item forecasts. Okay, so in multiple item forecasts, we're not just asking, well, will this be done? We're asking, when will they all be done? Or how many can we get done by this date? We have to use a different flow metric. A cycle time metric can only tell us about one item. What we need to know for forecasting how long it will take us to finish multiple items is a rate metric. Velocity is a rate metric, the number of whatever type of thing you finish in a given unit of time. Because we are forecasting how many things we can do and when will all these things be done, we're not going to use a proxy for that. We have a metric that tells us how many things we finish in a given unit of time. So we're going to use that metric directly. So the metric that we use is throughput, the count of actual items that pass your defined finish point, same definitions as before, in a given unit of time. So that might be today we finish 2 items, tomorrow we finish 0, the next day we finish 10. So units per day is what I'm using in this example. You can see a throughput run chart that shows you exactly what I just talked about, the variation of how much you finish in all given days. And you can see sort of predictability. If it's very narrow, then that's more predictable than if it's very wide. But this isn't enough information to help you do that forecast that you need to do, right? What we need is something that will help us flip that coin over and over again. And in this case, flipping that coin means doing multiple work items. Well, we're not going to do the multiple work items over and over again. That's sort of silly. So we can use a simulation. We can use a model, a modeling simulation to do that for us, to simulate doing that project over and over and over again. And I'm using project in a generic term, not as in a I'm advocating for certain types of groups of work. Okay, so what we need is a Monte Carlo simulation. Now there's a lot of stuff on the screen, so let me walk you through it really quickly. The first thing that you see here is that throughput run chart. So that's the exact throughput data. Today we finished this many, tomorrow we finish that many, etc. That's all that is. It's not anything fancy. And when we're asking when can we finish a given number of items, so that's the fixed scope, we need to give the simulation some information. We need to give it a start date, very similar to your GPS. It can't tell you an arrival time, or in my case, a finish date, until it knows your departure time, or in our case, a start date. It could try to give you a duration, but we're talking about when, not how long. So we give it a start date, and then we tell it, well, how many items do we have in our fixed scope? So in this case, we have 45 items. So essentially that might be the number of items currently in your sprint backlog, or the number of items in your release, your product backlog, or your release plan, or your project plan, or whatever you are doing. It's how much do you know about right now, right? And then what it's going to do is not magic. You can do this with a spreadsheet. And you can even do it manually, but I don't suggest it because it gets pretty tedious. But what it's going to do is it's going to pretend, it's going to simulate doing this project 10,000 times, right? And just think each of those trials is what we call it. Each of those 10,000 trials is going to go through a number of days that it takes to get those 45 items done. And so it starts with day one, and then it randomly grabs a dot from your throughput, right? And it says, oh, today I got 12, great. So 12, now we've got 33 left, right? So then it randomly grabs another dot, today's 0, bummer, right? And it keeps doing that until you finish 45, and it looks, how many days it take? What is that date from today? And then it says, okay, I track that, and it does that 9,999 more times. And it builds this pretty histogram. I'm not going to show you right now because that scares some people. And just with the dots on the scatter plot, it can look at all the outcomes from those 10,000 trials and say 50% of the outcomes had me finishing these 45 items on or before this day. 85% of those trials had me finishing these 45 items on or before this day, right? And then a better human-friendly way is to put it on a calendar, right? Because then I can take this calendar to my boss and say, look, there's an 85% chance we'll finish these on May the 25th. Well, if that would, let's pretend next year, because that's in the best. And they might say, oh, I wanted the 19th, right? And then you can talk about, well, that's only 50% likely. What can we do to change the odds of that happening? Because remember, if we don't change anything, this is what's likely to happen because this is what we've been capable of so far. And you can have all those normal conversations that one has about how to improve the odds. And you can make assumptions and hypotheses and come play around with things. But the most important thing to know is not how to generate the first forecast from when you first, come in and say, this is the items I know about. It's even more important to come back as you finish some of those 45 items and get updated forecasts. Because as you're working on them, you're getting new throughput data. That's your new normal. If a condition changes, it's going to catch it, and it's going to always be able to help you react to new situations, exactly like your GPS, right? Now, GPS doesn't give you a probabilistic forecast, so let me just put that out there. It's not a perfect correlation, but it does react to new data as it happens. You don't get your forecast and then shut it off and say, okay, 21 minutes later, I'll be there, right? You leave it on so you can see how the forecast changes as stuff happens. So you want to come in and say, okay, today we have 40 items left because we finished 5. Tomorrow we might have 43 because we added 3 and didn't finish any, or stuff like that. So and we have new throughput data. So continuous forecasting, Super important. Now, the only difference for answering a fixed date question, which is how many items can we do by this day, so I can see about how much of my product backlog or something I think we can really plan for, is instead of putting in a number, we put in the date, because we put in if we wanted to tell us that number, basically. And the other one, we wanted it to tell us the date. This one, we wanted to tell us a number. We have a fixed date, so we put in that start date and the end date, and it does very similar stuff. It does 10,000 trials. It does the same exact random sampling of your throughput, but instead of going until it hits 45, it goes until your end date and sees how many it can get done. Does the same building in the histogram, looks at the probabilities the same way, and you just have to find a way of looking at it that works for you. In this, we let you choose a percentile, and every day you can see, okay, we're 85% chance of getting this many done by this day, that kind of thing. So we're looking at, you want to get a probabilistic forecast based on what you've done in the past and give people an easy way to understand that. And then talk about, if people aren't happy with that, then you can have conversations about what to do to change that, right? And then you come back and keep forecasting. Yeah, and so that's what this kind of forecast would look like. There's an 85% chance that we can finish maybe 67 or more items by then, right? The dates are usually by this date or less, but when you're doing a number of items, it's this many or more, right? Because we're always going to the more optimistic part. So we start with the worst case scenario for that 85% and say, but it could be better, that kind of thing. This is for kicks and giggles, and we're not going to talk about how this works, other than it really is the same exact kind of forecasting, but on steroids. So there are ways that you can sort of do cascading Monte Carlo. So you can say, I've got multiple efforts. This is how many are in this one. This is how many are in this one. And, how likely it is we'll finish by this due date, but here's really how likely it is based on the forecast certainty that you want and all of that. So you can do those kinds of things. We'll stop for, last 5 or 6 minutes for questions here in a second, but I want to cover the summary here. If you don't remember anything else, these are the important points to remember, that if you can have more than one outcome, so even just two, if there are two possible outcomes or more, you need to start thinking in probabilities. And so you need to find data to help you get those probabilities. You can't sit there with your expert estimates and get the probability. The data has to help you. You might be able to. If you can, let me know. But I don't think our brains sort of work that way. We need data to really understand probabilities. Now, probabilistic forecasts, again, they show risk in those two ways. That probability with the upside, we call that 85%, and the downside, the 15%. But it also has a range of outcomes. We're telling you the chance that you'll fall into this range, not a single outcome. You choose the probability by thinking about your risk tolerance and, balancing missing the forecast with having too much padding in your forecast. And then you can have tools, but you can also do it very manually, right? So I'm going to leave that. Actually, I'll go here just so you know how to contact me. Or no, I've got my Twitter stuff here. So I'll leave that there, and I'll just open it up for the last 5 or 6 minutes for questions. And hopefully this is helpful.
So yes, great. Okay, see one question. Can this be used to forecast how much work to take into a 2-week sprint?
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what we teach in the professional Scrum with Kanban class is that's a fixed date question, right? I've got a 2-week period. How much work can we do? So we use that in our team to look and see how many items we generally finish in a 14-day period. And so we pull that many items. We usually use like 85%, and you'll hear people use 85. There's no magic thing that makes that the right choice. Pick whatever works for you, that's just generally what we use. And yeah, we say, okay, let's plan for this many. we'll probably finish them all, but we might not. That's okay.
Michael had a question here. Let's see. Does this translate to plus or minus 15% time needed to complete, or just 15% of the time turnaround time changes without providing potential date changes? I'm not sure if that, Michael, I may not have represented that well.
It's not a 15% of the time that I give you as the forecast. So I'm not saying it's 16 days or less. If you want all the possibilities, add 15% of that time to it. That's not what that is. Those outliers could be, and I'm using outliers loosely. They might not actually be statistical outliers, just so for the data geeks out there. What I'm saying is that 85% of the time in the past, it took us this long or less to do work. So I'm using that based on, I'm okay with the risk that sometimes we'll be beyond that. Now, how much beyond that? I can look at the data and get an idea, but I'm not communicating that to you. If you need a higher certainty, you can definitely go into that with people, but you can never be 100% certain. Even if you said, if you try to give a plus or minus, something could always happen that never happened before. So you can't be certain.
Cool. Looks like that was helpful. What population of tasks would you say is needed to sharpen the estimating accuracy sufficiently?
I'm not sure what that means. Maybe someone could type that, but I want to go back to the question that I deferred, and I don't know if it's related. So statistically speaking, they say you need somewhere between 7 to 11 items to have enough data to even bother trying to be responsible with statistics. We, in the stuff that we do, we settle on a minimum of 10 items. Now, whether or not that's enough really depends on the composition of those 10 items. If they are fully representative of what you're trying to forecast, so the same mix and stuff like that, because we did talk about how there's variation in those items. We're not trying to, really narrow it down and get a forecast for this, a forecast for that. You can, but what I showed wasn't doing that. So if I wanted to use my entire data set to make a general forecast, then I need a data set that has enough points to have the right variety of work. Didn't leave anything out. So at least 10, but I can't tell you the top number. It won't be thousands. If it takes you that many data points to get there, then I think what you think is your representative data might not actually be your representative data.
Okay, so that's a surprisingly small number, I think. I remember looking at that before.
Yeah,
That's a
people
lot
think,
less than I would assume
yeah,
it would be.
yeah, and you don't have to take my word for that. Definitely, that's something that I learned from Troy McGinnis, from Dan Vacanti, from just go research statistical, stuff, and that's not something that I made up. So, yeah.
When looking at how the forecast changes, therefore the number of completed work items is increasing, can you use too many data points?
I would say it's not so much that you can use too many, but you can use data that's no longer representative. If
Okay.
that data is consistently representative, its existence won't change the forecast. But if the data is no longer representative and it represents maybe variation that's not there, then using it will skew your data in an unrealistic way, either for too optimistic or too pessimistic. So more recent is good. You don't have to have years of data, even if it's all the same. In fact, probably, yeah. More recent data is better than older data, but it still needs to be representative. If it doesn't add any additional value, then you don't need it.
Okay, well, I think we're right about at time. I think we got most things here. Julia,
Yeah,
thank you so much for coming,
yeah.
and thank you everybody for showing up. I will follow up with an email. Julia, I'll get some of those links from you and make sure we send those out so everybody's got them in case they didn't write them down. And thank you everybody for coming. We may be taking a bit of a break for the next on into August, so I'll send out an email about that. But thank you everybody, and we'll see you coming up here soon.
Nice. And feel free to ping me with any questions we didn't get to. You've got my Twitter stuff here, and you can probably Google me and figure out how other ways. So talk to you soon.
Cool. Thank you everybody.
Bye bye.